My son said, "You're moving to a nursing home and I'm selling your house." I didn't resist and signed the papers. For 2 weeks, he and his wife celebrated their successful deal. When the buyers came with the money, the notary showed them my surprise. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Elaine Caldwell, and I have lived in this house for 41 years. I want you to understand what that means before I tell you what happened. 41 years. I painted the kitchen yellow myself back in 1983 because Harold said yellow kitchens make people happy, and I believed him. I planted the rose bushes along the front walk the summer our son Derek was born, and every spring they came back without being asked, reliable as sunrise, which is more than I can say for some people. Harold died in March of last year, quietly, in the blue recliner he'd had since Reagan was president, and I became a widow at 73. The house became mine entirely then, not just in feeling, but on paper. We had always owned it jointly. After Harold passed, I transferred everything properly through probate. My name, only my name. For the first few months after Harold's death, Derek was attentive in the way children sometimes are when grief is fresh and guilt is easy. He called on Sundays. He came for Thanksgiving with his wife, Renee. I made the cranberry sauce from scratch, and Renee said it was wonderful, and I noticed she didn't eat any of it. Small thing. I filed it away without meaning to. The new year brought changes I didn't recognize as changes at first. Derek began asking questions about the house that felt more like assessments than conversation. "What do you think it's worth now, Mom, with the market the way it is?" He said it the way someone says a thing they've been rehearsing. "You know, a place this size is a lot for one person." Renee nodded at everything he said with the careful enthusiasm of a woman who had practiced nodding. I answered honestly, the way I always have. I told him I was managing fine. I told him Harold's pension and my Social Security were enough. I told him the house was not a burden, but a home. He did not seem to hear me. In February, Renee began accompanying Derek on his visits more regularly. I should have welcomed that. I tried to, but there was something in the way she moved through my rooms, slowly, measuring, that made me feel like furniture being appraised. She would pause at the window in the living room and look out at the backyard and say, "This really is a lovely lot," in a tone that had nothing to do with loveliness. She asked once almost casually whether I had ever thought about downsizing. I said I had not. She smiled the smile of someone who is not finished yet. March came, the roses started to bud, and my son sat down at my kitchen table, the table where he had done his homework for 12 years, where I had signed his permission slips and his birthday cards, and told me I was moving into Meadowview Senior Living and he was selling the house. He didn't ask. He told me, "Mom, we've talked to some people. The facility is very nice. You'll have your own room, activities, medical support nearby." And honestly, he paused here, and I watched him choose his next words like a man choosing a tool. "A house this size is just too much for one person at your age. It's not practical." Renee sat beside him, hands folded, already dressed in the role of the reasonable one. "We just want what's best for you, Margaret," she said. And perhaps she believed it. That is the most frightening kind of lie. The one the liar has told themselves so many times it no longer feels like lying. I looked at my son. I looked at my kitchen, yellow as it had always been. I thought about Harold in his blue chair. I thought about 41 years and rose bushes that came back without being asked. And I said nothing, not yet. But inside, something very old and very quiet shifted. I had raised this boy. I knew his hands, his voice, the way he looked at a thing he wanted. And what I saw on his face that afternoon was not concern. It was calculation. I was not angry. I was not afraid. I was, for the first time in a long time, entirely, coldly awake. After Derek and Renee left that afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The coffee went cold. The light changed. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and then was quiet. I am not a woman who cries easily. Harold used to say I had the emotional metabolism of a glacier, which he meant as a compliment. And I did not cry then. I simply sat and let the full weight of what had just happened settle into me, the way cold settles into an old house, through every crack and seam. I went through it methodically, the way Harold had always gone through things. What is the problem? What are the facts? What can be done? The problem was not difficult to name. My son believed, or had decided to believe, that I was a resource to be managed rather than a person to be considered. The house, our house, Harold's and mine, the yellow kitchen and the rose bushes and 41 years of Saturday mornings, had become, in Derek's mind, an asset. An asset that would be significantly more liquid without me living in it. Meadowview Senior Living was not a kindness. It was a transaction. The facts were these. I was 74 years old. I was widowed. I had no siblings living. My closest friend, Barbara, had moved to Arizona after her hip replacement. I had neighbors I liked but did not confide in. Derek was my only child, and he had just told me, in the careful language of people who believe they are being reasonable, that my life as I had known it was over. But here was the other fact, the one Derek had apparently forgotten or chosen not to consider. The house was mine, entirely, legally, indisputably mine. My name on the deed. My signature required for any sale. I was not confused, I was not incompetent, and I had not agreed to anything. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the house around me, the specific creaks and hums of a structure that has learned to breathe with its occupant. And I thought about what my options were. I could refuse outright, say no, plainly, and hold the line. But I had already seen the way Derek spoke to me that afternoon, patient and managerial, and I understood that a flat refusal would simply begin a longer campaign. He would escalate. He would involve lawyers, perhaps, or doctors. The suggestion of incompetence is a powerful weapon against the elderly, and I was not naive enough to think my own son was above using it. I could call a lawyer immediately. That was tempting. But if Derek learned I had retained counsel, he would become more careful, more strategic. I needed him to believe he had already won. I needed him not to be careful. And so, lying in the dark in the house I had lived in for 41 years, I made my first decision. I would appear to cooperate. I would not fight visibly. I would give Derek exactly what he wanted to see. A tired, compliant old woman who had come to accept the wisdom of her son's arrangements. I would sign what I was given to sign. I would visit Meadowview and say it seemed fine. I would let them celebrate, and while they celebrated, I would act. The next morning, I drove to the public library on Elm Street, which has always been my favorite kind of place. Orderly, quiet, and full of information that belongs equally to everyone. I asked the young woman at the reference desk for anything she had on property law in Ohio, real estate transfers, and power of attorney. She gave me a small stack of materials without asking why, which is another thing I have always appreciated about librarians. I spent 4 hours reading. I took notes in the small spiral notebook I carry in my purse. By the time I left, I understood several things I had not understood before, and one of them was this. There is a legal instrument called a life estate, which allows the owner of a property to transfer the deed while retaining the permanent right to live in it until death. And there is another instrument, less well known, called a remainder interest. And there are protections under Ohio law for elderly property owners that Derek, I suspected, did not know existed. I also knew I needed help, not just information, a person. A real estate attorney who was not connected to Derek in any way. I found her in the phone book. Yes, I still use the phone book. On the following page. Her name was Patricia Owens, and her small advertisement said, Real estate, estate planning, elder law. Serving Columbus families for 22 years. I called from the library parking lot. Her receptionist gave me an appointment for the following Thursday. I drove home. I made dinner. When Derek called that evening to ask how I was settling into the idea, I told him I was thinking about it, and that Meadowview did seem like a pleasant place. He sounded relieved. He sounded already like a man who believed the hard part was behind him. I said good night and hung up the phone and sat in Harold's blue chair, which I had never moved, and I thought, Derek, my darling boy, you have made a very serious mistake. You mistook my silence for surrender. Patricia Owens's office smelled like coffee and paper, which immediately put me at ease. She was in her mid-50s, compact and precise, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and the manner of a woman who has spent 20 years listening to families in crisis without losing either her patience or her clarity. She shook my hand firmly. She did not speak to me the way some younger people speak to the elderly, slowly, with exaggerated care, as though age were a mild form of deafness. She spoke to me the way you speak to someone whose time is valuable and whose mind is intact. I told her everything. I told her about Harold's death, the transfer of the deed, Derek's visit, Renee's appraisal gaze, the conversation at the kitchen table. I told her what I had read at the library. I told her what I suspected and what I feared and, most importantly, what I intended to do. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mrs. Caldwell, you came in here better prepared than most people I see who have actual legal degrees. Let me tell you what your options are. What she told me was this. Because the house was entirely in my name, Derek had no legal authority to sell it, force a sale, or transfer ownership without my consent. His talk of arrangements and practical considerations had no legal weight whatsoever. I could simply refuse, and he could do nothing. However, and this was the part I had been thinking about, simply refusing was not my only option, and it may not have been my best one. Patricia confirmed what I had read about life estates. She also introduced me to something called a Medicaid-compliant irrevocable trust, which would protect the property from any future attempt to claim it was an asset if I ever did need long-term care. And she told me about something else, a step I could take that would end Derek's scheme so thoroughly and permanently that there would be nothing left for him to attempt. She told me I could transfer the deed into a trust with a specific named remainder beneficiary, someone other than Derek. We talked for 90 minutes. When I left her office, I had a plan that was more complete than the one I had walked in with, and I had a second appointment scheduled for the following week to begin paperwork. I drove home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table and thought about what I had just set in motion. 3 days later, I got the first direct evidence that Derek was not merely being assertive, but was actively, deliberately deceiving me. I had asked Patricia, as a precaution, to run a title search on my property, a routine procedure, she said, that would confirm there were no encumbrances or claims I wasn't aware of. What the search revealed was this. Someone had already contacted 2 real estate agencies in Columbus requesting a comparative market analysis on my property. The requests had been made under the name Derek Caldwell, listing himself as the estate representative of the property. There was no such designation. I had granted Derek no power of attorney. He was not my estate representative in any legal sense. He had simply told 2 real estate agencies that he was, and they had believed him, and they had sent him documents valuing my home at $412,000. I sat with that number for a while. $412,000. The yellow kitchen, the rose bushes, 41 years. Patricia called it premature and misleading conduct. I called it what it was. My son had already begun marketing my house without my knowledge, misrepresenting his authority to do so. It was not yet criminal. These were inquiries, not transactions. But it was a clear window into his intentions and his willingness to lie to achieve them. I thought about calling Derek. I imagined his voice, the way it would shift into that careful, patient register. Mom, I was just doing research, just getting information. And perhaps a woman less awake than I was would have accepted that. Would have said, "Yes, all right, I understand," and handed him the door key along with her dignity. But I had seen the number, $412,000. And I understood now that whatever my son felt for me, and I do not doubt that some portion of it was genuine affection, it was currently subordinate to that number. The following Tuesday, I signed the first round of documents in Patricia's office. I did not tell Derek. I did not tell anyone. That evening, Derek called to ask if I had given any more thought to Meadowview. I told him I had. I told him I was coming around to the idea. I told him the room they'd shown me in the brochure looked comfortable. He was warm, relieved, pleased with himself. He said he was glad I was being so sensible about it. Sensible, he said. I thanked him for his concern, as I always had, and I hung up the phone, and I went to bed and slept better than I had in 2 months. The plan, as Patricia and I had refined it, worked like this. I would continue to appear cooperative. I would agree to the sale. I would sign the documents Derek brought me. Or rather, I would appear to sign them, agree to them, create the impression of full compliance. At the same time, Patricia was preparing the actual legal instruments, a transfer of the property into a revocable living trust, with me as the sole trustee for my lifetime, and the designated beneficiary being the Columbus Community Foundation, a charitable organization I had supported for years. Derek was not named in the trust. Renee was not named. No one in my immediate family was named. The trust included a provision that was Patricia's particular touch of precision. It specified that any sale of the property required not only my signature as trustee, but a secondary confirmation letter from Patricia's office, submitted to the title company at least 72 hours before closing. Without that letter, no reputable title company in Ohio would process the transfer. We filed the trust documents on a Wednesday. The deed was transferred into the trust that same afternoon. As of Wednesday, March 8th, Derek could not legally sell my house even with my signature, because my signature on his documents would mean nothing. The house no longer belonged to Margaret Caldwell, the individual. It belonged to the Caldwell Family Living Trust, and the terms of that trust were unknown to anyone but me and Patricia. Derek had scheduled a signing appointment for the following Friday at the offices of a real estate attorney named Garrett, whom I had never met and whom Derek had apparently retained. I intended to attend that appointment. I intended to be cooperative and pleasant right up until the moment the door opened on what I had done. But I did not reach Friday undisturbed. On Wednesday evening, the same day the trust was filed, Derek appeared at my door without calling first. He had not done that in years. He was alone. He came in and stood in my living room with his coat still on, and he was not using the patient voice. He was using a different voice, one I had heard only a handful of times in his life when he was a teenager and thought he had been denied something he deserved. "Mom," he said, I need you to tell me what's going on. I offered him coffee. He declined. Someone told Renee that you've been going to a lawyer's office on High Street, a real estate attorney. He looked at me with something that was trying to be concern and was not quite succeeding. Why are you talking to a lawyer, Mom? If you have questions, you come to me. I come to you. Of all the things he said to me during those weeks, I think that is the sentence I will remember longest. You come to me. As though I were a child. As though my questions about the disposition of my own home were something to be managed by the very person who was attempting to take it from me. I told him I had simply wanted independent advice, that I was older and sometimes confused about legal language, and wanted to make sure I understood what I was signing. He didn't believe me entirely. I could see it. But he couldn't afford not to believe me either, because the alternative, that I was several steps ahead of him, was apparently not something he had prepared for. Then Renee's voice came from the doorway. She had been waiting in the car. She came in now, and whatever pretense of casualness had been in place dissolved. She told me, with the directness that comes when people feel their money threatened, that if I was thinking about doing something complicated with the property, I should understand that it could create problems for everyone. She used the word family several times, in a way that meant our interests. She suggested that an elderly woman living alone, making legal decisions without consulting her son, might raise concerns about her judgment, about her capacity. There it was. The word I had been waiting for. Capacity. I looked at Renee. I looked at my son, who did not contradict her. And I said, very clearly, I would like you both to leave my home now. There was a silence that I think surprised all three of us. Then Derek tried once more. Calmer, hands up, reasonable face back in place, telling me that no one was trying to upset me, that they just wanted to make sure I was protected. I told him I was perfectly protected, thank you, and that I would see him at the appointment on Friday. They left. I locked the door and stood in my hallway for a moment, listening to the car pull away. Then I called Patricia and told her what had happened. She said, "Good. That means they're worried. Worried people make mistakes." She was right. But I was also shaken. I will not pretend otherwise. I was 74 years old and I had just been threatened, softly, carefully, with plausible deniability and the word capacity, by my own child. I made chamomile tea. I sat in Harold's chair. I gave myself 3 days to rest and feel whatever needed to be felt, which turned out to be grief, mostly. Not for the house, not for the money, but for the person I thought my son was, who it appeared had never quite existed. On Thursday morning, I called Barbara. She answered on the second ring, which is how Barbara has always answered the phone. None of this letting it go to voicemail, none of this texting back later. Barbara has been my closest friend for 37 years, since we were both young mothers on the same street and our sons played in the same yard, which gives me no pleasure to think about now. I told her what had happened. All of it, from the beginning, the way I had told Patricia. Except with Barbara, I did not have to choose my words carefully, and I did not have to appear composed. I sat at my kitchen table and told her my son had tried to take my home and had threatened to have my capacity questioned, and Barbara listened the way she always has, which is to say completely, without offering solutions until she was certain she had understood the problem. When I finished, there was a pause. "Margaret," she said, "have you eaten today?" I laughed. It was the first time I had laughed in weeks. "Yes," I said. "Good. Now listen to me. You have already done everything right. You went to an attorney, you protected the property, and you've kept your nerve. You are not confused. You are not helpless. And what Derek did, what he said about your capacity, that is a threat. And threats only have power if you let them frighten you into doing nothing. She was right, of course. That is one of the gifts of a long friendship. Someone who knows you well enough to say the thing you already know, but need to hear from outside your own head. Barbara also told me something practical. She had a friend in Columbus, a woman named Helen, who volunteered with an organization called Elder Right, a nonprofit legal advocacy group that assisted older adults facing exactly these kinds of family property disputes. Not a law firm, but a resource. People who knew the terrain. I called Elder Right that same afternoon. A coordinator named James spoke with me for nearly an hour. He confirmed what Patricia had already told me about my legal standing, and he added something important. If Derek or Renee ever formally challenged my mental capacity, the standard of proof required was substantial, and a woman who had independently retained legal counsel, understood complex trust documents, and managed her own finances was not a woman any court would easily find incompetent. The challenge was a threat, he said, almost certainly an empty one. But he gave me the name of a geriatric psychiatrist who offered brief competency assessments for exactly this kind of situation, a precautionary documentation that would make any challenge by Derek nearly impossible to pursue. I made an appointment. In the meantime, I noticed something shift in the house. The anxiety that had been sitting in my chest like a stone for the past 2 weeks. Since Derek had first sat at my kitchen table with his managing voice and his arranged future, had not disappeared, but it had changed in quality. It had become something more useful, not fear. Readiness. I had Patricia. I had Barbara. I had Elder Wright and James. I had documentation in process. I had a trust that Derek knew nothing about. I had an appointment on Friday that he believed was a formality, and was not. A week before that appointment, I met Patricia for coffee at a shop on Broad Street, and we went through everything one final time. She had confirmed the trust filing, confirmed the secondary letter provision with the title company, and confirmed that the attorney Derek had retained, this Garrett, was not aware of the trust because he had not run an independent title search. He had taken Derek's word for the state of the property. Another mistake, Patricia said, in a tone that suggested Garrett was not going to enjoy his Friday. How do you feel? Patricia asked, stirring her coffee. Calm, I said. And it was true. The specific cold calm of a woman who has done everything she could do and is now simply waiting for events to unfold the way she has arranged them to unfold. Patricia smiled. Good, she said. That's exactly the right feeling. I drove home through the Columbus afternoon, through streets I had been driving for 40 years, past the library where this had all begun, past the grocery where I still shopped on Tuesdays, past the church where Harold's funeral had been, and where I still went on some Sundays, out of a habit that had become something more than habit. My city, my life. My house waiting at the end of my street, with its yellow kitchen and its budding rose bushes. No one was taking it from me, not now, not like this. They came on Sunday. I was reading in the living room when I heard the car in the driveway. The particular sound of Derek's Audi, which has always announced itself a moment before its driver does. I did not get up immediately. I set my bookmark in my page and waited for the knock, and then I went to the door and opened it. They were both dressed well, not formally, but carefully, in the way people dress when they want to seem approachable, but also want you to understand that they have resources. Derek had brought flowers. Grocery store flowers, still in their plastic sleeve, but flowers. Renee was holding a dish covered in foil that she said was a casserole she had made. She said it with the smile of someone performing warmth rather than feeling it. I let them in. I put the flowers in water. I thanked Renee for the casserole and put it in the refrigerator. I made coffee. We sat in the living room, the same room where, 3 weeks earlier, Derek had stood with his coat on and his anxious voice and the word capacity hanging in the air between us. He sat now in the chair nearest the window. Renee sat beside him on the small sofa. I sat across from them in Harold's chair, which I do not apologize for. Derek began with the weather, then with how busy work had been, then, after approximately 4 minutes of this, with what he had apparently come to say. He told me he'd been thinking about our recent conversations and felt bad about how things had come across. He said he and Renee had never intended to make me feel pressured or unheard. He said, and this is the sentence I noted most carefully, that they only wanted to make sure I was making decisions with full information. Full information. He said it with a look of such transparent concern that I almost felt sorry for him. Then Renee took her turn. She said she had done some research on Meadowview and wanted to share some materials with me. She produced a glossy folder from her bag, and that there were also some tax benefits to simplifying one's estate in advance of certain contingencies. She said the word contingencies in a way that meant your death, though she did not say that. She told me she had spoken to a financial advisor, their financial advisor, who had said that holding a property of this value in one's sole name at my age was actually a significant liability, and that the cleanest approach was a direct transfer. I let her finish. Then I said, "What transfer do you have in mind, Renee?" She looked at Derek. Derek looked at me, and I saw it, just for a moment before he recovered. The thing he actually felt, which was impatience. He was tired of the performance. He wanted to close this transaction and move on. He was a man looking at money he had already spent in his mind, and the only obstacle left between him and it was his mother sitting in her dead husband's chair, asking questions. He reached into his jacket and produced a document. He explained that it was a simplified transfer of title, a gift deed, that would transfer the property to him and Renee for tax purposes, with a verbal agreement. He said verbal agreement without flinching, that they would handle all the costs and management while I continued to live there. A verbal agreement. I looked at the document. I looked at my son. I thought about Barbara on the phone from Arizona. I thought about Patricia and her coffee. I thought about James at Elderite and the young librarian on Elm Street who had handed me a stack of materials without asking why. "Derek," I said, "I appreciate you coming. I understand what you're trying to do, and my answer is no." The temperature in the room changed. Renee's smile went first, then Derek's patience. He said, with a precision that told me this was prepared, "Mom, if you keep making decisions like this on your own, without advice from family, we're going to have to consider whether you need additional support in managing your affairs." There it was again, not a question this time, a statement. I looked at him for a long moment. My son. My only child. The boy I had rocked and fed and driven to school and worried over and loved without reservation for 50 years. "I have already consulted an attorney," I said. "I have already made my arrangements, and I have already been assessed by a geriatric psychiatrist who has documented my full cognitive competency. Any challenge to my capacity will be met with that documentation." Derek stared at me. "I think you should go now," I said. They left. Not the dignified exit of people who have made their point. The tight-jawed, furious exit of people who have realized they are losing. I stood at the window and watched their car reverse out of the driveway. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. I felt underneath the residue of the scene a clear, clean thread of something I can only call determination. They had shown me the mask. Not the careful, reasonable son mask, not the concerned daughter-in-law mask. The real one. The one that comes out when money is close and patience has run out. I was afraid. I will not lie to you. but the fear fed directly into my resolve, and by evening, it had become something that felt almost like peace. I arrived 10 minutes early. I wore the blue suit I had worn to Harold's retirement dinner 20 years ago, which still fit because I had always been careful about such things. I carried my purse and my copy of every relevant document in a manila folder Patricia had organized. I had slept well. I had eaten breakfast. I was 74 years old and I had never felt more prepared for anything in my life. Patricia was already in the lobby when I arrived. She stood and shook my hand and said quietly, "Everything is in order. Let's go." She had a second folder under her arm, thicker than mine, and I noticed she had tabbed each section with colored markers. The kind of preparation that communicates without words that the person across from you has done this before and is not afraid of the result. Derek and Renee arrived at 10:03. Derek was wearing his good suit. Renee had her hair done. They looked like people arriving at a celebration, which in a sense they were. They had been celebrating, Patricia later told me, for nearly 2 weeks. Renee had apparently already given notice at her gym that she would be relocating. She had also, I later learned, told 2 of her friends that she was coming into a property situation that was finally being resolved. Resolved. That was the word she had used. As though I were a problem. As though my home were an equation. Relocating to my house. The buyers arrived at 10:10. A young couple, the Hendersons, pleasant-looking and clearly nervous in the way of people about to spend a significant portion of their lives' savings. They came with their own attorney and a cashier's check for the amount Derek had negotiated. $408,000. We all went into the conference room. Garrett, Derek's attorney, sat at the head of the table with his documents and his professional manner. He had the look of a man who expected to be done with this by noon. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, and he had not offered anyone else one, which told me something about how he ran his practice. He began the process of presenting the purchase agreement for signature. He addressed me directly as the seller, which was correct. He asked me to confirm my identity and my ownership of the property at 4417 Linden Avenue, Columbus, Ohio. I confirmed my identity. Then I said, "Before we proceed, I'd like to introduce my attorney, Patricia Owens, who has some information relevant to the title." Garrett paused. He looked at Patricia. He looked at Derek. Derek's face did something complicated. Patricia placed a single document on the table. She explained, in the clear and even voice of a woman who has done this before, that the property at 4417 Linden Avenue had been transferred into the Caldwell Family Living Trust on March 8, 2024, with Margaret Elaine Caldwell as sole trustee. She explained that the terms of the trust required her countersignature on any sale documentation submitted to the title company no later than 72 hours prior to closing. She noted that no such letter had been submitted because no such closing had been authorized by the trustee. She placed the trust document beside the first document. She placed the title search beside that. She placed one final document, the filing confirmation from the Franklin County Recorder's Office, date-stamped, in the center of the table where everyone could see it. Garrett was reading. His expression was not the expression of a man who is surprised so much as a man who is experiencing the specific professional horror of realizing his due diligence had been inadequate. He had not run a title search. He had taken Derek's word that he had authority to sell. He had not verified a single claim. He had sat across from my son, accepted his documents at face value, and built an entire transaction on the assumption that a 74-year-old widow would simply comply. That assumption had just cost him considerably more than a morning. Derek stood up. "This is," he started, and then stopped. and then started again. "Mom, what did you do?" "I protected my property," I said. "You can't just— You didn't tell me." His voice had left the managing register entirely. He sounded, for the first time in months, like himself, like the frightened boy he had been on occasion, the one who had always hated being caught. I remembered once, when he was 11, finding a broken window in the garage that he had hidden behind a tarp for 3 days. He had worn that same look then, not remorse exactly, but the shock of a person who has discovered that the world keeps records. Renee said sharply. "Can this be contested?" Garrett said, with the caution of a lawyer beginning to distance himself from his client. "The trust appears to be properly formed and filed. The terms are enforceable. There must be something." Derek looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, exactly. Desperation. "Mom, we can work this out. We can talk about this." Now he wanted to talk. Now, with the cashier's check on the table and the buyers shifting in their chairs and the attorney across from him reading a document that had dismantled 2 weeks of celebration in approximately 4 minutes, now he wanted to have a conversation. The Hendersons' attorney leaned over and spoke quietly to the couple. The Hendersons stood. They picked up their cashier's check. The young woman, Mrs. Henderson, looked at me with an expression that I think was sympathy or perhaps recognition, and they left the room without a word. The door closed behind them with a soft and final click. Garrett began collecting his documents with the controlled movements of a man hoping to exit a situation cleanly. Derek watched his buyers leave and his attorney gather his papers, and the celebration that had been 2 weeks in the making dissolved entirely, like something that had never quite been solid to begin with. "Derek," I said, and my voice was completely steady. "The house is mine. It has always been mine. It will remain mine for as long as I choose to live in it. If you have questions about what happens to it after my death, I suggest you consult an estate attorney. Independently. Not this one." Garrett did not look up. I picked up my folder and my purse, and I thanked Patricia. And I walked out of that conference room and through the lobby and into the March sunlight of Columbus, Ohio, where the sky was very blue and the air smelled like the end of winter. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. I had not realized, until that moment, how much I had been holding. My shoulders dropped. The sun was warm on my face. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck was making its rounds, and 2 pigeons were arguing on a window ledge, and the city was going about its ordinary Friday the way cities do, indifferent and continuous, and I was standing in it, intact. The silence from Derek lasted 11 days. In those 11 days, I cleaned the house from top to bottom, not because it needed it, but because I needed to. I washed the kitchen windows and the kitchen walls, and I repainted the back bedroom, which had needed it for 2 years. I found, behind the dresser I moved to reach the baseboard, a small drawing Derek had done when he was perhaps 7. A house with a yellow door and stick figures in the yard, and his name spelled carefully in the bottom corner. I held it for a long time before putting it back. Not on the wall. Back where I had found it, behind the dresser, where it had waited for 30 years without demanding anything of anyone. I called the rosebush supplier I had been using for 20 years and ordered 2 new plants for the front walk, because 2 of the originals had finally given out the previous fall. I had dinner with a neighbor I'd been meaning to have dinner with for a year. On the 12th day, Derek called. Not the careful voice, not the managing voice, his actual voice, which I had not heard in months. He said he wanted to apologize. He said he had behaved badly. He said he was sorry. I listened to the full apology. I did not interrupt, And I did not soften it by telling him it was all right before he had finished saying it. He needed to say all of it. That was part of what it meant for the apology to be real. Then I said, "I believe you're sorry, Derek. And I believe things became true this spring about who you are and what you're willing to do that I cannot unknow." He started to say something. I said, "I've spoken with Patricia. I've updated my estate plan. The trust stands as it is. Depending on your choices going forward, your position as a beneficiary of anything I leave may or may not change over time. That will be a function of your behavior, not my anger. I'm not angry, but I am clear." There was a silence. Then he said, "Are you going to Meadowview?" "No, Derek," I said. "I'm going to stay in my house. I'm going to plant new roses, and I'm going to live my life." He did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was different, smaller. "Okay, Mom," he said. "That was not the end of the consequences, of course. The world does not resolve neatly just because a confrontation is over." Garrett filed a formal complaint with himself before anyone had the opportunity to file one against him, a kind of preemptive damage control, and declined to bill Derek for the full engagement. The Ohio Real Estate Commission received a brief inquiry about Derek's representation of himself as the estate representative to the two agencies that had provided market analyses. Patricia made that call. She made it without drama and without apology, the way she did everything. The inquiry was noted. Nothing criminal was found because nothing quite criminal had been done. But the notation existed, and in the way of these things, it was not nothing. These records have a way of surfacing at inopportune moments, Patricia told me, and I believed her. The Hendersons found another property 2 months later, a 3-bedroom on the north side of the city, a better fit for them than my house would have been, their own attorney told Patricia in passing. I was genuinely glad. They had walked into my story through no fault of their own, carrying a cashier's check and a reasonable hope, and they deserved their own good ending. I amended the trust. Patricia drew up revised documents that clarified the distribution of the estate with more specificity than before. The Columbus Community Foundation remained a beneficiary. There were others I added: Barbara's granddaughter's college fund, a small scholarship at the high school where Harold had once coached baseball, and a sum designated for the Elder Right organization that had helped me understand my rights when I most needed to. Each addition felt deliberate. Each one said something about who I was and what I had valued, which is, I think, the proper purpose of an estate plan. Not a punishment. A portrait. Derek was not removed entirely, but his share was materially reduced, and the trust specified the conditions under which it could be accessed. He could read those conditions when the time came, or he could begin now to live in a way that changed them. That was the offer I left on the table. Not forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever fully, but the possibility of a different future, earned through different choices. That was the most a mother could do. That was also, I think, the appropriate consequence, not punishment for its own sake, but the logical result of what he had chosen, and a door that remained narrowly open. I kept the casserole dish. I washed it and put it on the shelf. Whatever Renee had put in it, and I confess I had thrown the actual casserole away without eating it, which felt both petty and entirely justified. The dish was a good size, and there was no reason to waste it. I used it the following month to bring soup to Dorothy from my watercolor class, who had come down with a cold. She said it was the best chicken soup she'd had in years. I did not tell her about the dish's provenance. Some histories are better left unremarked upon. By July, the new rose bushes had taken hold. They were not as full as the ones that had finally given out. They would need another season before they reached their proper height. But they were healthy and blooming, pink at the edges. the same variety I had planted the summer Derek was born. I found a certain satisfaction in that continuity that I did not try to analyze too carefully. Some things speak for themselves. I had coffee on the porch on the mornings that were cool enough for it, and I watched them from my chair, and I thought that Harold would have liked them. He had never paid much attention to the roses specifically, but he had always noticed when the front of the house looked well, and he had always said so. My life settled back into its shape, or rather into a new shape that fit the woman I had become through those spring months. I had Patricia's number in my phone. I had James at Elderwright, who had sent a card after everything resolved. A simple card, no flourish, just his signature and the words "well done," which I put on the refrigerator, where I could see it. I had Barbara, who called on Sundays now instead of waiting for me to call her. A small shift in the mechanics of our friendship that meant more to me than I could easily say. I took a watercolor class at the community center on Tuesday evenings. I had always meant to, and had always found a reason not to. I was not especially talented, but I enjoyed it. And the woman who taught the class, a retired school teacher named Dorothy, had opinions about color and light that I found genuinely interesting. We began having coffee before class, and then dinner afterward on some weeks, and then she became, without either of us planning it, one of the people I thought of as mine. I traveled. Nothing dramatic. A long weekend in Savannah, which Harold and I had always meant to see and never had. I walked along the squares in the September heat and ate shrimp and grits at a restaurant with ceiling fans, and sat by the river one evening, watching the light go gold on the water, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was simply present. A week later, I visited Barbara in Arizona, where we sat on her porch in the evenings and talked the way we had always talked, the way that requires no particular subject, because the point is not the subject. I slept 10 hours every night I was there, long and dreamless. Barbara said I looked 10 years younger. I told her she was biased. She said that didn't make her wrong. Life, which had contracted sharply in the months after Harold's death, expanded again. Not back to what it had been. Harold was not there, and I did not pretend otherwise. But forward, into a version of itself I was making rather than inheriting. And what of Derek and Renee? I will tell you, because it is part of the story, and because I do not think the truth serves anyone by being omitted. Derek and Renee had, during those early spring months, already spent money they did not yet have. Renee had put down a deposit on a larger apartment. They had planned to move into my house, which meant vacating their current lease, which meant losing a deposit. The financial pressure was not, I am told, small. They had also borrowed from Renee's parents on the basis of an expected asset that did not arrive. Renee's parents were not pleased. From what reached me, and I want to be honest that this was secondhand, filtered through the social geography of a city where 2 family generations have lived for decades, there were significant and sustained arguments about the loan. Renee's father, a practical man who had built his own business from nothing and had opinions about due diligence, was particularly unforgiving. The loan was called in. Renee and Derek managed to repay it, but the repayment required sacrifices that showed up in smaller ways. The vacation they did not take, the car lease that was not renewed, the gym membership that Renee canceled in July. Not relocated to, simply canceled. Garrett's professional reputation had suffered in the quiet way that professional reputations do suffer in specialized fields, where word travels within the community. He had made a basic error in due diligence, and it had become known among the people for whom it mattered. He did not lose his practice, but the specific quality of his clientele shifted, in the way of these things, toward the less discerning. Derek lost his ease. That is the truest way I can put it. The smoothness with which he had moved through the world, the certainty, the impatience that comes from believing one is always going to get what one wants, had developed a fault line. I saw it the 2 times we spoke over the summer, brief and careful conversations in which he was trying to find the version of himself that I would recognize. I did not make it difficult for him, but I did not make it easy either. Both things can be true. He came in August, alone. Renee did not come, which told me something about the state of things between them. He sat at the kitchen table, Harold's table, my table, and he did not manage the conversation. He talked and stopped and started, the way people do when they are genuinely trying. He told me he thought about his father. He told me he thought about the choices he'd made and what they said about the person he had been becoming without realizing it. That last part I believed. I think there are people who move gradually into greed the way others move gradually into bad posture. Incrementally, without noticing, until someone holds up a mirror. I made coffee, and I sat across from him, and I listened. The way a mother does when she has not stopped loving her child, but has also stopped believing that love requires the surrender of herself. We talked for 2 hours. Nothing was resolved and everything was acknowledged, which is sometimes the best version of resolution available. He did not ask about the trust. I think he understood now that some things cannot be negotiated and should not be. The trust would say what it said. His choices, going forward, would say what they said. The distance between those two things was the space in which something better might eventually grow if he chose to tend it. When he left, I stood at the door and watched him go, and I thought about Harold, and about 41 years, and about the rose bushes that had come back again. The house was yellow inside, and quiet, and mine. So that is the story of the spring I nearly lost my home, and didn't. Here is what I know now that I knew before, but more deeply. Love is not a debt owed, and silence is not consent. A woman who does not speak is not a woman who agrees. She may simply be a woman who is thinking. If someone in your life has ever mistaken your patience for surrender, I hope you remember this. Patience can be preparation in disguise. What would you have done? Would you have fought back or found a quieter way? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave your thoughts below. Your stories matter, and some of you, I suspect, know this particular kind of hurt better than you'd wish. If this story meant something to you, stay with me. There's more. And thank you, truly, for listening.